Every few hours, the three of us, Mom, Curly, and me, would do a shadow check. It was as second nature as taking a sip of water. "Shadow check," my mom would call, and we'd both look down, checking that our shadow was still there. I thought everyone did this. We were homeschooled, so no one really told me otherwise. And my one friend down the block, Samantha, was a little strange herself, so she never seemed to notice. But then, Mom got a job, and Curly and I went to school, and that's when everything collapsed. "What are you doing?" Paige asked me, as we stood outside for recess one cool fall afternoon. "Shadow check," I replied. "Duh." "Shadow check?" she asked, confused. "What's that?" I squinted at her. "You don't know what a shadow check is?" It was like she'd told me she didn't know how to brush her teeth. I explained, slowly in simple terms like I was talking to a baby. "You look at the ground to check your shadow is still there." She obediently looked at the ground. "There it is!" Then she raised her arms out in front of her and linked them, making her shadow look like the letter P. "Look, it's like P for Paige." In no time at all, half of the class was doing it. We'd bound out for recess, and someone would shout, "Shadow check!" The kids would contort their bodies into weird shapes to make their shadows look like elephants or cats or letters, and we'd try to guess what they were. That went on nicely for about 3 days. Then, horror struck. On Thursday afternoon, it was overcast. "Shadow check," Thomas shouted. I diligently looked down and saw my shadow, but when I looked up, I realized nobody else had a shadow. For a second, I wanted to panic and scream and run, but then I took a deep breath and did exactly what my mom taught me. I grabbed Paige first. "Hey," she protested, but I didn't listen. I held on with a vice grip and started pulling her back towards the school. When the shadow goes away, hide in darkness for a day. The mantra echoed in my head. The school had a basement. I'd heard the teachers mention it. The basement would be safe. All we had to do was stay there until the morning. "Let go of me!" Paige screeched, finally yanking her wrist out of my grasp. "What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with you?" I screamed back. "We have to hide." The kids weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at me, backing away, like I was a rabid animal. "We have to hide!" I screamed again. "All the shadows are gone!" I grabbed at Paige again, but she dodged this time. I lost my footing and fell onto the asphalt. Pain stung my knees. I looked up at my classmates. Why aren't they hiding? "What are you doing? Run!" I screamed. That's when a teacher helped me up and took me right to the principal's office. I should have explained more clearly, my mother told that night, as she tucked me in. The shadow thing is only for us. It's okay if other people don't have shadows. Why? Sadness flashed across her face for a second. Then she shook her head. That's just the way it is. No one talked to me at recess anymore, not even Paige. I sat alone all the time. I noticed now that there were many days, and some classrooms even, when people didn't have shadows. I always did. But they didn't. Months passed, and eventually kids forgot about the incident. That's what kids do. Forget. Sometimes I wish forgiving and forgetting came easier to adults. Paige would run up to me at recess, and we'd play hopscotch. She never brought up the fact that even on an overcast day, my shadow still danced across the chalk lines, mirroring my own movements. Except sometimes, they were the slightest bit out of sync, like my shadow was moving on a split-second delay. As I got older, however, things got more complicated. In 7th grade science, the teacher taught us about the sun and optics and light, prisms and rainbows and the cones and rods in our eyes. And she mentioned that our shadow was just the absence of light, that our bodies were blocking out the sun or the overhead fluorescent lights. It didn't make sense to me then that my shadow, or anyone else's, would be able to disappear. If the lighting didn't change, and I didn't move, how could a shadow suddenly disappear? Curly was now old enough to insist we called her by her real name, but she was still too young to understand the argument I had with my mom that night. "It's not possible," I shouted, as she worked on her coloring book upstairs. "You're lying to me." "I'm not lying to you," my mother pleaded. "Yes, you are." I ran across the living room to get in my mom's face, walked right past the ornate glass lamp that stood on the end table. My mom's eyes widened. She looked at the ground, and that's when I realized my shadow was gone. The lamp was behind me. My shadow should have been on the floor in front of me, but it wasn't. "Run," she whispered. When I didn't move, she began to shout, "Go to Curly! Go!" I hesitated for half a second, then I sprinted for the stairs. "Turn off the light!" she shouted after me. I darted in and closed to the door. Then I bent down and yanked out the plug to the lamp. "Hey," Curly said, "I'm coloring." "Shh," I whispered. "What?" My shadow disappeared. Curly was too young to remember the day her shadow disappeared. She'd only been a year old. Mom had scooped her out of the playpen, grabbed me by the hand, and took the three of us into the basement. We spent the night down there, in total darkness, eating canned beans and sleeping on old comforters, laid out on the cement floor. But she knew that it was bad. She scrambled over to her bed and pulled the covers over her head. I stood in the center of the room, listening for Mom's footsteps. They never came. Is she staying down there? But we had so many lights on down there, it would be safer to just run to us. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding, slipping over the Barbies Curly had all over the floor. "Mom?" I called out, through the door. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. I could see the stairs, the light spilling out from the living room, but everything was silent. Maybe she went into the basement. Maybe. A shadow appeared, cast across the wall. No, she's still down there? But no, that couldn't be my mom's shadow. It was too short. And even though the edges were blurry, the shadow sort of looked like it had a ponytail. Not a short hair and a pixie cut, like my mom. That's not Mom. That's me. The blurry edges sharpened, and then the figure, the shadow, came into view. My ponytail, my upturned nose, my knock knees. The thing crouched down and pulled at something, yanking it, moving completely independent of me. A dragging sound. My mother's feet came into view, still and lifeless. I gasped. My hand clapped to my mouth, but it was too late. The shadow froze, turned to stare directly at me, and then with huge, loping strides it started up the stairs. I slammed the door shut, clicked the lock. Then I jumped under the covers with Curly, my entire body trembling. The police never found Mom's body. She was eventually declared legally dead. Curly and I were sent away to live with our grandparents. They didn't seem to know anything about the shadow. They never asked us to do shadow checks. The only remark in 10 years was my grandma, on a particularly cloudy day, remarking how strange it was that I cast a perfect shadow on the sidewalk in front of us. I watched it as I walked, and noticed its movements weren't perfectly in sync with my own. As the years went by, and my shadow didn't disappear again, I started to get complacent. I checked for it less and less frequently. I started to lead a normal life, getting hired as a real estate agent. Curly, now going by her name Rebecca, is 19 and in college. I even started to persuade myself that my shadow didn't kill her, that my mom ran away after our fight, and my memory of the shadow was my way of coping with it, because it was harder to accept my mom had abandoned us than it was to accept an evil shadow had killed her. That's what I told myself. Until tonight. As I sat down on my computer to finish writing a house listing, I noticed there was no shadow of my fingers on the keyboard. No shadow on the linoleum under the desk. I ran to turn off all the lights, but I don't think I was fast enough. Because when I ran to close the blinds to block out the light from the street lamp below, I saw my shadow, walking across the dark street, disappearing into the night. So please, I beg you, if you see any strange shadows in your home, or outside, something you don't think is cast by the lights, by the objects in your home, something that looks different, hide. Somewhere pitch dark where no shadows can be cast until morning. Life is hard growing up not knowing your biological father. Having your friends and family look at you and treat you like a freak is damaging. Growing up knowing you are slightly different than others is difficult. Trying to talk to others about things you can hear, see, feel, and having them look and talk to you like you're crazy is hard. I'm 32. I was born June 6, 1989 in Mon Valley Hospital in southwestern Pennsylvania, and after 31 years, I finally was able to meet my biological father, and believe it or not, we hit it off really well. Even after growing up hating him for thinking he abandoned me. Even though my stepdad has been there since day one, it still does something to a young kid's mind. Back to meeting my birth father. Though the really crazy thing is finding out that everything that I have that I thought made me a freak actually runs deeper in our blood than just me. My whole family on my father's side has it. Me, my father, his brothers and sisters, his mom, and on down the line is sensitive. Being sensitive to the paranormal world and growing up not having support from anyone makes you grow up taught me to be tough, strong, and only to depend on myself. That's how I was until I met my family and found out that I'm not the only one. Now I'm trying to get the word out and trying to help people. I want people to know that they are not alone. When I was about 4 or 5, I remember having an imaginary friend. It was a very tall, all-black shadow creature-looking thing with piercing green eyes. It was always around when I was younger, but as I got older, it only came around before something bad was going to happen. I tell you this for reference for later on. This is going to sound completely crazy, but I'm telling you this happened, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was the first paranormal experience I had. Well, at least I think it was the first. But it's the first one I can fully remember, and it was the reason why I have been searching for answers ever since. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I remember wanting to go upstairs to my bedroom. As I was walking up the stairs, I remember something feeling off, like the vibe felt different. Once I got to the top of the stairs, I remember seeing my mom standing in the bathroom. Then it felt like I was frozen in place, like something was controlling me and wouldn't let me move. As I'm standing there, something came around me and it felt as if something was trying to come out my body. My mom looked at me and asked what was wrong. All I could do was wave at her before it looked like some kind of black mist came out my chest and violently pushed me down the steps. As weird as it sounds, as I was rolling down the steps, it was almost like I was seeing myself fall down the steps. After I rolled down the steps and was at the bottom, I heard my mom screaming for my dad who was downstairs. When I looked up, I watched him run down the hall to me while my mom was running down the steps. I looked up above the front door, which stopped me when I hit the bottom of the stairs, and I seen what looked like myself before it pretty much dissipated, and I came back to and started crying. While I was being checked for injuries, I kept looking around for whatever was that I seen. After my mom asked me what was I looking at, and why did I wave at her, then jump backwards down the stairs. After she says this, my dad looked at her, then at me, and said, "What do you mean jumped?" She said it looked like I just jumped backwards, like I meant to do it. That's when I said no, I didn't mean to do it. It felt like I was pushed, and that I didn't remember waving. Not too long after this happened, my mom, who was now pregnant with my little sister, found me sleepwalking, which I never done up until that day. She said she found me trying to push my way through the closet in my bedroom. I literally opened the door, pulled the toys out of my closet, and proceeded to try to push through the wall in the back of the closet to try to get to my parents' bedroom, which happened to actually be in that direction. My poor mom, scared shitless and had some kind of wooden club for protection, said she thought someone broke in through my window and was looking around. Even though our bedrooms was upstairs, my bedroom window was next to a steep hillside, and you could literally jump from the hillside to the little roof where my window was and climb into the window. I done it many times. But if you missed or slipped, it was a good 20 or 25 feet drop. Even at that young age, I wanted and thought I was a daredevil. My mom gave birth to my sister on June 3rd, 1997. Yay, she was my early birthday present, LOL. Then in September of that year, we moved to the house that my family is still at to this day, which was my stepdad's great aunt's house. They moved her into a nursing home then. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, she passed away at the tender age of 105. Anyways, as my sister grew up, we all said she was reincarnated because she would talk about stuff that she never heard of before, way before she started school. Not to mention she had imaginary friends who, as creepy as it sounds, turned out to be real people. The one I remember, his name was Sammy Love. I'm not sure how she knew who he was, but I found out in like 2015 that there was someone named Sammy Love who lived in the 1800s, which freaked me out. But my sister talked about him between ages 2 to like 5 or 6, then just stopped out of nowhere. When she was like 10 or 11 or so, she was in the computer room in the basement doing schoolwork or playing games, and she out of nowhere screams and starts crying harder. Then I ever seen her cry while running upstairs to my mom, who was in the living room, and said that she heard what she thought was someone breathing in her ear. She said it was to the point where she could feel the warmth of the breath. And when she looked back, nobody was there. My mom, thinking it was me trying to prank my sister, called me out of my room and asked me about it. I told her as much as I loved messing with my sister, it wasn't me. I was shocked when she actually believed me. Then she told me to walk down with my sister and make sure nobody was down there while she called my dad to tell him about it because he was coming home soon from work. We get downstairs. My sister explained to me what happened as I was looking around. Obviously nobody was there, but the vibe seemed very odd, almost like someone or something was watching us. My dad came home and said that it was probably just her imagination from watching scary stuff with you mom and brother, and not to watch any more scary stuff, which didn't happen. After that, my sister had a few more things happen over the years, but nothing major. Me, on the other hand, shit was just getting started. When I was 15, I was getting ready for school. I got out the shower, got dressed, and jumped on the computer to put an away message on AOL and Yahoo Messenger, because that was the cool thing to do back then, LOL. Anyways, as I was doing that, I heard my mom come downstairs and say my name as she went into the bathroom, because my bedroom at this point was right next to the bathroom. I asked what did she say, because I didn't really hear her, even though my door was slightly open, and I didn't get a response. I didn't think much about it until I heard the bathroom door open and seen who I thought was my mom walk out the bathroom and said my name again as she was walking back upstairs. I came out of my room to see what she wanted, and she was nowhere to be found. So I went to walk upstairs. I figured she just went back up to lay back down and wanted me to come talk to her. As I was walking up the steps, I could hear my sister snoring because she takes after her dad. And as I walk in my parents' room, I realized it was eerily silent besides the fan that was on. I whispered, asking my mom what she wanted, to only get no response again, so I shook my mom and she jumped up because I startled her and she asked me what I wanted. I looked at her like she was crazy and was like, "Mom, you was just downstairs and yelled for me, then walked back up here." As I said this, she looks at me like I was crazy and she was like, "I didn't just walk downstairs, I never got out of bed," which absolutely freaked me out. That night I'm laying in bed. It was about 11:30 or 12 at night. I just got off the phone with the girl I was dating at the time and was trying to go to sleep. As I'm laying there, something felt really weird, like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't, and at that point I happened to look above my head where my fan was sitting on my chair, and I seen this dark shadow that was standing in front of it. The window was letting in a little bit of light from the moon and street light, but it was like this thing was either blocking out the light or almost like absorbing it. It freaked me out so bad I closed my eyes and wiped them, then opened them and it was still there. I closed them again, shook my head, and opened my eyes again. And this thing was gone. I was able to see my fan, and it seemed a little brighter in the room as well. A week later I told my grandma about it, and that's when she told me that there was a double murder-suicide in the house. Then she tells me that one person was killed in my room. They found the body exactly where my bed was. On top of that, the suicide happened in my room as well. I always knew something felt weird in the house, and when she told me this, it cleared everything up for me. I ended up staying at my girlfriend's house for 2 weeks, refusing to stay at my house because I felt that was a sign. My parents and my girlfriend didn't believe me when I talked about this stuff. They all thought I was crazy, and they wanted to 302 me and put me in a nut house or psych ward, whatever it's called. So I stopped talking about it. Me and that girl dated for almost 6 years. We broke up in 2008 midway through my senior year of high school, and the rest of the time we was together, I never brought up things I felt or seen again. I had little things happen and seen stuff all the time, but fast forward to August 10th, 2010, my little cousin birthday. I was home by myself, it was storming, so I was playing Left 4 Dead on Xbox 360 when out of nowhere the air got real thick. I got up, started looking around my house. When I went into the living room, that imaginary friend I had as a kid, that tall, black, green-eyed thing, was standing there. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't do anything because I was frozen. After standing there for what seemed to be for an hour, but it was only a few seconds, it dissipated, and at that moment, I knew something was coming. Sunday, August 22nd, 2010. I was over a girl's house laying in bed when my mom calls me at around 8:30 in the morning. She answers the phone and wakes me up and hands me the phone, and I hear my mom on the other end telling me she has bad news. She tells me that my cousin Chucky, who just turned 20, was killed the night before at a party. All I could do was cry. Fast forward to a year later, it was actually the year anniversary of my cousin's death. I see the shadow again. A few days later, we get a call saying my great-grandmother on my mom's side had a stroke and was in the hospital, and I knew it was only a matter of time. On September 3rd, Labor Day, she passed away, and the day of the burial for her daughter, which was my great-aunt, who up to that point beat pancreatic cancer for 2 years. I believe it was ended up getting sick. We later find out it came back, and it was 3 times as worse. While at the funeral, when my aunt runs into the bathroom, I go off into a room myself to clear my mind. A few minutes goes by and I get called out because I was a pallbearer. When I was about to walk out the room, I heard a noise behind me. I turned and seen the shadow again, but this time it was different. When I seen it, I got angry and just yelled at it, telling it to leave me the fuck alone. Everyone looked at me like I was nuts, so I lied and said I was on the phone. November 6th, my aunt sadly ended up passing away, and it was absolutely devastating. I seen the shadow a few more times before a few more people I was close to passed away, but I found out it's not just when people are going to die that I see the shadow. When I was 23, I tore all the ligaments in my knee playing football. The morning it happened, I knew something didn't feel right, and while I was driving to the field, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I seen the shadow which damn near caused me to wreck my car. I was so upset when it happened, I actually thought about suicide because the doctor told me I tore it so bad, he's never seen one that bad. I ended up healing pretty fast from that, and for a while did really well, ended up meeting my fiancée and buying a house and just enjoying life for a while. Then something happened again. I seen the shadow again in December of 2019, but not just once. I seen it every single day. I ended up getting deathly sick right around when COVID-19 hit. The doctors still don't know exactly what is wrong, but I, out of nowhere, had trouble breathing to the point where I couldn't even get out of bed. I've never had anything like this happen. I've played football almost my whole life since I was 8, and mixed martial arts for close to 16 years. I've always been a very active person, so I took it really hard when I got sick and couldn't do anything. March 24th, 2020. I got sent home from work due to being exposed to the virus, so I got tested. It was clear I ended up being tested 9 times since the beginning of all this, and every time it's been clear. On March 30th, I stopped breathing out of nowhere and went to the ER, got sent home, and was doing kind of all right for a month. May 1st, 2020 at 2:30 a.m. I walked from the bedroom to the living room, and out of nowhere, my chest got really tight, and I started having trouble breathing, and eventually stopped breathing. I ended up going unresponsive twice in the ambulance, and they had to shock me back to consciousness. In the hospital, I went unresponsive for just under 8 minutes, and they had to shock me again. While I was gone, I kept hearing, "It's not time. It's not your time," then waking up. I've been battling this illness to this day. Today's date is November 8th, 2021. I'm finally starting to get to the point where I'm able to do stuff again, but a little at a time. While I was really sick, I did have suicidal thoughts because I didn't think I was ever going to get better. There was a few times I felt like I was getting better, then something would happen and it would put me right back to where I started. It's been a while since I've seen the shadow, but I know that if something is going to happen, I will be able to prepare for it because the shadow will appear before it happens. The final thing I would like to share is when I met my birth father. I found out that the land my house is on was in the family for approximately 200 years. When he was a kid, he lived in a house that was on this land, same with his dad and grandfather and so on. I find this crazy because I didn't know, even though I've been coming down this patch of land my whole life. My grandparents live across the road from where my house is. They have lived there for the last 45 years. Throughout that entire time, I never knew my biological dad lived there. I mentioned that to tell you that the 3 houses that were here before mine had all burnt down, and there were a few people that passed away. The whole patch is haunted, and everyone residing there believes it, as well as the whole town of Brownsville, Pa. When I tell people what patch I live in, if it's someone who has lived in the town their whole lives or in the surrounding area, they all say, "Oh, the CSX haunted patch." For a while, I didn't know what that meant until I did some research. I discovered that back in the 1970s or 1980s, CSX Railroad had a station down in the patch that has history of being in use way back in the late 1700s to early 1800s. I remember when I was a kid, the old turntable where they turn the train engine around used to be in the giant gravel lot across the road from my house, and there was a few people who lost their lives there. Now, the railroad tracks are still there and they use them every day, but they have since moved the old railroad crossing that used to be right beside my house. It is now located a half-mile down the tracks and created a new road entering in the patch about 15 years ago. The old crossing didn't have crossing arms to stop traffic. Since I was born, there were 3 people that got hit by trains. 2 in vehicles where one person did live and didn't have many injuries due to the train moving slow. However, the other person's truck was completely torn apart. They claim he died on impact and the other person committed suicide. He laid down on the tracks while the train was coming. Not knowing the full history of all of this at the time, my fiancé and I moved into the house we are currently residing in, back in 2016. The house that's sitting on the same land that has taken the blood of my past family members. With all the weird happenings and death, it doesn't surprise me that our house has a crazy bout of activity. Shortly after we moved in is when I had my first experience in the house. I got home from work and naturally wanting to get out of my dirty work clothes due to, at the time I was a utility maintenance guy, so I went to the bedroom to change. My fiancée was scheduled until 5 that day. She was a nurse at the same company, so I knew it was going to be close to another hour before she was due to be home. After I get changed, I take the dog out, she does her business. Then we come back, go to the bedroom, and I turn on the TV. As I'm sitting in bed, I notice the dog is staring at the door. Her ears are up, almost like she's on point. I can clearly tell she hears something, but figuring she was just hearing the cats, I didn't put much thought into it. Until I start hearing footsteps coming down the hallway. It wasn't just any footsteps, though it sounded like a playful child mixed with heavy boots running down the hall. This startles me because we don't have children. By this time, the dog is barking to the point where it sounds like she's ready to rip someone apart. At the time, she was a 1.5 years old, 8 to 10 pound miniature pinscher mix, so in all reality, she really wouldn't do much damage, if any, but she makes a good alarm. When I first hear these footsteps, I reach over and grab my 12-gauge shotgun and aim. Standing my guard, I'm expecting for the bedroom door to swing open and someone to come in, and nothing happens. A minute goes by, so I open the door, gun leading the way, and I start to do a sweep through the house, only to find that nobody is in the house. In fact, it's locked up the same way I locked it up about 10 minutes prior. My fiancée gets up, and I tell her what happens, and she plays it off at first until a few days later when she hears it for herself. This has happened quite a few times throughout the almost 5 years we lived in the house. Moving forward to September of 2020, we went to a flea market. During one of my times I was feeling better, and came across a lady that was selling a haunted mirror for $5. She told us this incredible story about this mirror and her house as she was crying. During her telling me this, I felt how scared she was, so we bought it because I was intrigued. I needed to see it to believe it. Since we got it, the activity in my house has gotten a lot worse. Prior to the mirror purchase, it didn't feel mean or evil in our home, but after we got the mirror, you can feel how the vibes in the house became slightly sinister. I've woken up with scratches and experienced night terrors. On the night we brought the mirror home, we both had nightmares, and then the next morning we walked outside and there was a 5-foot black snake in our yard. I've been in this patch, like I said, since the day I was born, and never not once have I seen a snake unless it was closer to the woods, not close to the train tracks. It was just a really weird coincidence, and even as I type this, my laptop keeps malfunctioning as if it is possessed or something. LT feels to me that something don't want me to talk about it. Ever since we got the mirror, I've been keeping track of the haunting activity occurring, and have been putting them on my YouTube page, so if you would like to check it out, it's at My Haunted Life Joe Stump. Before I end this, I got one last experience that happened just yesterday, July 21st, 11. I walked into the kitchen to get candy and a drink. As I walked out of room and back to the bedroom, a cup that has been sitting on the microwave literally for 1.5 to 2 years was pushed off out of nowhere. We was able to catch it on our security camera, and I put it on my YouTube channel. It was really cool, and I'm happy we caught it because it's really good evidence, but we are both still a little shook since it happened. We have had a good bit of creepy and weird stuff happen that last few days. Each time it progressively gets slightly worse. It might be time to sage the house. I'm just worried that it will just piss off whatever it is that's in my house. Addiction took our mother slowly, rocked her through it, and sung her to sleep, sunk deep into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The missing pieces of her kept safe, so she wouldn't be lost forever. So maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters the radiators would bleed rust. But it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me, with lopsided band-aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, music channel on full volume on the TV, shaking our hips before they were fully grown. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learnt from a young age we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking light, she shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes, when the weather was right and she'd had enough being drunk alone, she would call our school up and tell them we had both come down with summer sickness, and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car, coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her bend over our kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter, radio up and windows down blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavy, she'd be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day we'd just wake up to an empty house and the fridge packed full. Post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick in the outline of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke up to the ceiling, Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music they would blast until the a.m., and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table in the morning, asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, refrigerator a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once when I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet, and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seats, head resting in the crater of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything, until her mouth started to shake and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her. She'd stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find Mom passed out cold on her bed, sure she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd pissed herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoped we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she'd got the money for them. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness in the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down, Annie snapping grainy photos on her shitty Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, me and Annie weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I'd bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up too. Couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair fallen into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother, and then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I'd run for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we'd dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never put back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm. As we ate in silence, with every bite I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner, or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike, the cat that junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles. But Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah yes, that one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines. Right next to the ashtray. Left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy. Let's wish. So we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time, and definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back. Shit, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing. A promise unfulfilled. Em? Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Em, get inside now. She was staring out into the dark, past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under the chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried, like a child, lost in the dark. Not like a child, but as someone pretending, mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright, face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move, animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it. We watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face, hard, and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at our fingers interlocked. Both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the cops and everything is going to be... Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes. dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. "Your phone's on the porch," she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs charging. A soft tap-tap-tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass until they was slamming into the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped, and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs 2 at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once, and Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry, like a baby calling for its mother, filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. "What the fuck is going on?" I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heart beat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. "I'm going to get the phone from my room." I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. "Yes, I'm going to get the phone and I'm going to call the cops and we're going to be okay." I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me." I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. "Yes, promise me, Em." Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. "Promise," she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs, slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em?" came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" my voice cracked. "Mama, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay, just open the door, it's okay, just let me in." The handle rattled again, gentler. "Just let me in, it's all okay." She banged on the door and I took my handle of the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother. Please." Her voice broke and she started to cry. Just let me in, baby. I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid and I'd come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Yeah, Emily let us in. It's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. "Emily let us in." Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in, let us in, let us in," over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters, all the bedtime stories we pray don't crawl out from under the bed. "That's not my sister and you're not my mother," I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low, guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long, scraping claw marks, dragged down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway and soft down like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all, standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had come to hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, so high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that come in a bottle or a needle, or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in. I'm your average early 40s guy, recently divorced on my own with my 3 kids living with me every second week. This week the kids were at their mother's. I hated these weeks. The house seemed far too empty. To say I was suffering from empty nest syndrome would be an understatement. It was Monday, and what you would call a typical Monday. Work was frustrating. My crew and I were building a house, and we were in the framing stage. We had fallen behind, and nothing I could do motivated them. It was hot as hell. Usually I would have done shorter days, but we were so far behind I was doing all I could to catch up, including working until dark every night all by myself. I got home that night about 10:30, had a quick shower, a bite to eat, and crashed. About 3 o'clock or 3:30, I was awakened by what looked like a shadow in my bedroom doorway. Blacker than black, not transparent at all. I went to get up thinking someone was in the house. The dark shadow was immediately on top of me, pinning down my legs and arms. It had what looked like a body of some sort, sitting on my legs with two appendages holding my arms. I was in great shape at the time, working in construction and being an up-and-coming power lifter. Try as I might with all my strength, I couldn't move. I fought and fought, but no matter what I did, I couldn't move. All of a sudden it was gone, and I could move freely again. I sat up in bed shaking, wondering if that really happened, or if it was just a terrible nightmare. I decided it was just a nightmare, and wandered downstairs for a quick drink to calm my nerves. In about a half an hour I was headed back up to bed. The next day at work was just as frustrating, drifting even further behind schedule. I asked my crew if they wanted to change to a 4 a.m. to noon schedule for the rest of the week and beat the heat. None were interested. My guys were usually very good, but I guess the heat was too much for all of them. Looking back, maybe I should have shut down for the week. I worked again until about 10:30, then headed home. Same scenario as the night before. Shower, quick dinner, and bed. The last night's adventures a distant memory. Again, at around 3:30 I was awakened by the same black shadow in the doorway. As with the night before, in a flash it was on top of me, this time sitting on my abdomen. Again it was far too heavy or strong. Despite how I tried, I couldn't move, and this time I was having trouble breathing. I struggled and struggled, but it was no use. My head felt like it was going to burst from lack of oxygen. I started thinking that this was the end. I was just about to pass out and poof, it was gone. This time I got up and sat on the back deck sipping multiple glasses of Crown Royal. Despite still thinking that it was a terrible nightmare, I couldn't control my shaking. There was no more sleep that night. There's no need for me to mention the next day at work. It was very much the same. This time I only worked until 9 p.m. I was starting to burn down, and I had another day in family court the next day. My ex after more money, again. I did the same nightly routine and was in bed by 10:30, although I had a rough time getting to sleep. I finally drifted off about 1 a.m. Again, about 3:30 in the morning, I was awakened by the shadow. It was instantly sitting on my chest, cutting off my ability to breathe. It leaned forward until its face was about 3 inches from mine, forcing me to look into its black, bottomless eyes. They were more like empty eye sockets. I could taste what I could only guess was its rancid breath on my tongue. In a low, rumbling voice, I heard it say, "You're mine." Again, I was just about to black out when it disappeared. There was absolutely no more sleep that night. I got dressed and went to an all-night diner where I sat sipping coffee and shaking. That day I was in court. It wasn't a good day. Her lawyer was particularly nasty. To put it simply, I walked in with all my payments up to date and walked out owing $10,000. Her lawyer convinced the judge the nights and weekends I was hanging with friends working on their cars or houses was actually cash work. The judge wouldn't listen to me and nailed me with the 10G. I did go after that judge, but that's another story. To say I was in a terrible mood when I left would be an understatement. I went to the gym trying to work off my frustrations, but it was no use. After the gym, I went by the job site to see how things had gone without me. I shouldn't have. The owner was there and immediately started tearing a strip off me because my guys left at noon. I couldn't blame his anger, so I just continued to apologize. I had no excuse. On my way home, I stopped at our little pub's liquor store and picked myself up another bottle of Crown. I had completely forgotten about my little entity problem. My dinner that night was of the liquid variety. I killed the better part of my bottle. It was a good thing I only bought a 26R. I tossed and turned in bed, my anger boiling over. At about 3:30, me wide awake, I saw the black mass forming in my bedroom doorway. In a rage, I jumped out of bed screaming, "Not tonight, you asshole!" I bolted across the bedroom and slammed into the door jamb, almost knocking myself out. I never saw that entity again. So I'm not going to give my name, but I am going to give you some background on me and why the title is the way it is. So, let's start off with me first off. I'm a guy. If you were to see me on the street, you may think I'm a football player, and you would be wrong. I like other sports. So next up, I've been a believer in both the religion and in the supernatural, not the Sam and Dean Winchester stuff, for as long as I can remember. Heck, I grew up watching Tales from the Crypt, the original Ghostbusters 1 and 2. Now maybe I'll count the Afterlife as well. I haven't seen the latest one about being frozen. Mummies Alive as well as The Mummy, just to name a few. Anyway, but this isn't what influenced me. I've always been able to see things that other people don't. Most readers may believe me, and some may not. But when on my last post I'll share my thoughts on what I think is happening, and then I'd say, you are free to judge. So enough of that soapbox. I've always had the ability to see into the spirit real or another side. I think it's a family trait. But for the most part, this is how mine works. I don't know of anybody else's visions and how they work, so please don't ask. Usually mine works very much like a camera. Yes, I have a photographic memory. In short, I see with my physical normal eye a place then my mind's eye drowns out the normal stuff, and I see the shape of whatever is there. For me, it's like looking at two screens at once. Or if you're old enough to remember these, the old still photo projectors but with an overlay on them. Or I don't see anything in the natural at all, but instead will sense a presence, look over there, and then see someone or thing in my mind's eye. I see that person or thing. Yes, I'm awake during it. Sometimes yes, the person can be heavily on my mind, and other times not at all. That's just how my sight or vision works. Now I'm not saying everyone else does, that's just mine. Keep in mind this all happens to me in about a second or so. Please don't ask if I know how anyone else's works. So I'm going to start off with one or two when I was a child. Now for context, as a kid, I've been pretty smart but not schoolwork smart, and my mom was doing her best to raise me. As one can imagine, her work hours were long and I would have to go stay with a family friend while she worked. This family friend would bring me to church on Sundays. There was one particular man who took an interest in me, not in the Catholic priest sense. He began to mentor me. He was also a deacon in the church. When he began to get sick, he passed on his deaconship to me. I was a kid, barely holding my own in first grade, let alone for any type of leadership. Yet he did, as time went on, I was trained and taught the ways of the deacon, or at least the physical part. It was, I think, sometime later that I began seeing it. Since my mom worked the overnight shift, I had to stay the night with her. My mom's friend was retirement age, so no weird comments, please. We stayed in the same room, but I was on a fold-out bed that faced the doorway. Yet when I went to sleep at night and all the lights were turned out, I could make out the image of a man in the doorway. There were no men in the house. He never said anything. He never did anything. He never crossed the threshold of the door. Yet he was always there. I don't remember if I brought it up to anyone. Yet what I do know is that it stopped shortly after when the man who was mentoring me died. My biggest theory is that he was checking on me in the spirit world, to see if I was all right, like in a fatherly manner. My next one is similar, so a bit of history first. I met my grandfather twice, first time I was too young to remember, and the second time I was in second grade, I believe. He didn't live close to us, and when he saw me, he gave me a scowl that could curl paint, curdle milk, and make an FBI agent rethink his life choices. So yes, I was afraid of him. Thus, not someone I wanted to think about too much. Yet one night in September of '96, yes, it's important, I saw a full-figured outline and felt it was him right at the foot of my bed. He walked around my bed. He wasn't angry at me. The impression that I had gotten was that of a parent looking in to see if his kids were okay. I asked my mom about it in the morning, and she said that she had felt a presence in the house. She thought it was me. I replied, no, I stayed in bed all night. In February of '97, he died. It did hurt, but once all the preparations and the funeral were taken care of a few months later, my mom asked me about that night in September. As we both went over it, we both got the impression that it was my grandfather who showed up that night. Mind you, he has never been to the house, ever.